Welcome to integrating Axe accessibility tests into the Source Labs dashboard. This is also a talk about what accessibility testing is and how you can shift left and integrate accessibility testing into your development lifecycle. So why do you want to do this? Why would you want to integrate accessibility as far left in your development process as possible? Well, there's quite a lot of studies out there, and all of those studies, when they've been done, point to the same basic outcome, which is that if you can find and address a defect during your design phase of your development cycle, then if you assume that cost of that costs 1x, the further right that you find that defect and fix it, the higher the cost. So if you find it during development, it's going to cost you about 3 times as much. If you find it during QA testing, depending on where you find it in the testing cycle, it can take 10 to 15 times as much to fix it. And then if it makes it into production, the effort for finding that and fixing that and getting that back out is up to 30 times as much as it would be if you found it during design. So that's really the ROI message for why you would want to do this in the first place. The good news when it comes to accessibility is that 95% of the accessibility issues that we've found over the years, as we've gathered a lot of data from our customers, 95% of the accessibility issues we report to our customers, and that includes both those that can be found through full automation and those that have to have some manual testing applied to them, can fit into 12 of what are called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines success criteria. Now, depending on which level and which version of WCAG, as we call it, you're looking at, there can be between 31 and 51 of those. And so by concentrating your effort really on these 12, you can eliminate 95% of the issues. So that's another thing to keep in mind, that not all of your activities need to go into everything equally. Focus your efforts on where you're going to get the most payback. The next piece of good news related to that is that automated libraries like the Axe core library, which I'm going to be demonstrating to you today, one of the things I'm demonstrating, can find as much as 50% of the issues. In fact, we just reported last week as much as 57% can be found through automation, but a very consistent conservative estimate for how many you can find through full automation is about 50%. So, okay, that's a great number. Let's see what the effort is to leverage that within your existing application. So what I'm going to do is switch over now to my editor, and I'm going to show you an application that I've been working on. It's basically a React application, and it uses Cypress to do the automated testing. And it's very easy with a very simple adaptation for me to run the automated Axe accessibility tests at the end of every functional test that I already have. So if I've got a whole full suite testing, say 90% of my application's functionality, simply by pulling in the Cypress module, JavaScript module, and by injecting it into the page when I visit that page, and then calling check accessibility, or check A11Y as we like to call it, after each test is run, I can do an assertion that the state of that page at the end of that test doesn't have any of those 50% of the issues that can be found through automation. So that's a very simple way that you can build this into an existing test suite and get a lot of that payback. Of course, that doesn't test every user interface state that you might encounter in between. To do that, of course, then you would have to build in these check accessibility calls for each of those states. But that's the next level that you can go to take that to incorporate all those different states in the application. So let's see what happens if, now that we've got these embedded into our applications, if we run that. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to run Cypress in this sort of interactive mode. For those of you who are familiar with Cypress, you'll be familiar with this. And it's going to start up the Cypress dashboard, and then simply by pressing a button, I can run all my integration tests. And I'm pulling that up. It's loading up the browser here. You can see the tests loading. You'll see the application, which is running on my local host here, loading up on the right-hand side here. And you'll see little dialog boxes and things popping up as the tests get executed on my machine. So, okay, everything ran and everything passed. That's great. So how does this help me during the development lifecycle? Well, if I go back to my code and I come into my actual application here, I can make a change that introduces a very common accessibility issue, which is just not having an alternative text associated with an image that's in my UI. Now, two things I want to say about this. First of all, you'll notice that as I deleted that alt attribute and the role of presentational, which is essentially telling the screen reader that this image doesn't convey any information, what happened was this little squiggly line popped up there. So I'm in my VS Code editor, and when I mouse over that, you can see it pops up a thing that says ax linter image alt ensures image elements have alternative text or a role of none or presentation. And there's a nice little link in here that I can click on to get some information about that issue and how to fix it. But what you're seeing here is another part of that ax suite of tools that's a free linter plugin for VS Code. We also have one of these for IntelliJ. And that gives you instantaneous feedback as you're typing. It can't find quite all the 50% of the issues that the fully rendered ax core can find, but it's a really great add-on to ax core. So if I now save that file and I go back and I rerun my tests, it's building in the background, so my test should be running automatically. Actually, let me go back and just run the integration tests again. Then you'll see that without changing any of the tests that have run, you'll notice that things will start failing. And in this case, we've set it up that once it fails, it just stops the rest of the tests and doesn't continue. And so that gives you an example of the sort of guard that these automated ax tests running inside your test framework can give you to stop people from introducing new accessibility issues as they're coding. So that's great. What happens if I want to run these inside, for example, the source dashboard? Well, that's very simple. If you've got, for example, in this case, I'm running Cypress, I've got source control set up on my machine. And what that allows me to do is it allows me to run these tests. It bundles all the tests up together. It sends them off to the source lab server. And then the tests run on the source lab server. And that's great because I can run not only against Chrome, which I was running here, but I could run against Firefox, Edge, and all the other browsers and capabilities that I have inside Source Labs. All right, and now you can see that all the tests have run on the Source Labs server. And great news, all the tests have passed. And I can go and look at that now in the dashboard. So I'm going to go to my Source Labs over here, and you'll see that if I refresh the page, oh, actually, it was already there. It says there's a test there that ran 2 minutes ago. So that's about how long that test actually took, is about 2 minutes to run. And when I come into here, then a lot of you will be familiar with this. I have the recording of the screen as it was playing that, and I can replay that. And I can see all the details for all of the different tests that ran. I can see how many of them ran, how many of them passed, etc. Any accessibility issues that may have come up during the testing will also obviously show up inside the same dashboard. So that's a very easy way that you can get that same accessibility results showing up inside your dashboard. Now, just to go back to the code for a little bit and just to look at what we did once again, now that you've seen it running, what this is doing is it's calling check alley. And what that does by default is it just does an assertion to make sure that there are no accessibility issues whatsoever. For some of you aren't as lucky as I am, and to have a nice clean code base, you might be starting out where you've got a lot of accessibility issues, and you don't necessarily want to break your build and stop your tests if there are accessibility issues. The good news is you can take the results from running ax and you can write them out to the console, and you can generate reports that give you that output inside your Source Labs dashboard or in your console if you're running them locally. All right, let's go back to the presentation now. So what I just showed you is gives you about 50% of that feedback. The key takeaways there are get your developers to install ax linter into their IDE. That allows them to find issues while they're coding. The second key takeaway is to run that Axe automation in every test. Easiest way is to run at the end of every test. At least it runs once in every test, but you can also build it in at different points during the test to test different states of the user interface. And that'll eliminate 50% of your problems before you commit your code to the repo, do a pull request, and merge your code. So that's a huge payback for that. All right, but that still leaves the other 50%. So what can we do about that? So some more good news is that about 67% of the issues that you can that we generally find and report back to our customers, they can really be prevented by beginning your accessibility efforts with the design. So now remember when I talked about the ROI of testing and finding things during design? Well, 67% of these sorts of things can really be proactively prevented by the designer. So what does a designer have to do if they want to be able to help their team in that way? What are the types of things they have to learn? What do they have to do? Well, they have to learn a little bit about accessibility, or they have to bring somebody into their design process who knows about accessibility. What we do with our customers is we give them coaches, we give them training, and we also give them experts who can review their designs and give them that feedback. But the designers over time can pick this up and do it themselves as they do that. But really what it comes down to is that the designer takes out of their head the information that they put into the user interface design and communicate the relevant parts of that to the dev team that have to do with accessibility. So a lot of the time as a designer's designing their UI, they're thinking about it and thinking, what do I want, what am I trying to achieve here, and what sort of user interface element do I want to have, what does that do, etc. And a lot of that information is the exact same information you need to test for accessibility. So if you look at this mock-up that I have here, it's a wireframe of a recipe card. You'll notice that at the top of that wireframe, there's this little pencil rounded element. What is that? Well, as a designer, what I've done on the right is I've annotated the wireframe to add some semantic information. So I've put this little B bubble over here. That's telling the developer that that's a button. So don't implement this with a link. Don't implement with a div. Use a button element on this thing. The second thing you'll notice here from an accessibility point of view is I've given the accessible name for that element. And you would expect it to be edit. Yeah, great, I'm going to edit this recipe. But what I'm also telling the developer is to put the recipe name there. So in this case, it would read edit chocolate cake. If the recipe was mom's spaghetti, it would read edit mom's spaghetti. And that's kind of important. And then there's some other very important semantic information, like the fact that the image is decorative, the fact that this information here is a table, etc. All important pieces of information that I'm conveying to the rest of the development team. When I look at the full design comp, then there's additional stuff that I can convey. For example, I'm designing a focus outline for this edit button at the top here, and I've designed a second focus outline for this button at the bottom. I've also indicated the colors to use, exact colors to use for this text over here, and I've made sure to test those for color contrast to make sure that the color contrast ratio will pass. So those are some of the things that I'm going to convey to my development team as part of my design communication to tell them what to do. So let's take a look now at how the developer will use this sort of information during design and development. So the first thing is, if we're implementing this, what we need to do is implement this edit button. And let's assume that I've done that. I've implemented my edit button. I've implemented my recipe card. Here are my tests for that. Here is my code for my recipe button. And I'm going to go and I'm going to do some additional testing that takes me beyond the 50% that can be fully automated. The way that I do that is I'm going to use a tool called Axe DevTools Pro. And I'm going to come into my browser here. I'm opened up the DevTools, and with a simple click of a button, I can run all the automated tests that we saw running inside my Cypress tests. I'm going to save this test. I'm going to call it recipe card for recipe app. I'm going to save the test. And then what this allows me to do is Axe DevTools has built into it a bunch of tools that help me test the stuff that cannot be fully automated. So let me show you some of these because they're pretty cool. The first one is this keyboard test. Just by clicking start over here, what it's going to do is it's going to run through all the keyboard interactive elements on the page. And while it's doing that, it's doing a bunch of analysis. Then once it gets to the end of this, it's going to ask me some questions that'll help it determine, together with what it could find on the page, whether or not there's an accessibility issue. So the first thing you will notice is it found 18 tab stops. It's telling me to click next to continue. And now it says, we found these 18 tab stops. Were there any focusable things in the document that we missed? And I'm going to say, no, there was nothing missed. Let's move on to the next question. And now what it's doing is it's asking me for each of those elements that it found, whether or not that element is interactive or not. And I'm going to, by mousing over them, I can get the tool to highlight what it's talking about in the top, and I can answer the question. Now, I know that all of these elements are interactive, so I'm just going to go and say, yep, they're all interactive. And now what you'll notice is it found a bunch of issues related to this. So it's telling me that the element's role is missing or is not appropriate for the element's function. If I inspect this element over here, you'll see that I've used a div instead of a button to implement this interactive element. And so that won't work with a screen reader. Now, I didn't need to use a screen reader to find that issue. I just needed to use this tool, which knows how a screen reader works and looks at the markup and says, if that was an interactive element and you've done it this way, then you've done it wrong. A screen reader is not going to be able to utilize that. So that's a test that took us less than a minute and found 8 issues related to keyboard and screen reader interaction. So let me go to the next one, which is much more interesting as it relates to our design. It's called the buttons and links tool. It's going to test all my buttons and links on the page. So the first thing it does is it highlights them all and asks me if there are some that are not highlighted. I'm going to say no, nothing missing. And then it runs through all of those, and it's doing a bunch of tests to determine what their accessible name is, what type of thing they are. And you'll notice over here that the accessible name for this button is edit. Now, when we looked at the design said it's supposed to say edit, sorry, let's go back to the design over here. It's supposed to say edit chocolate cake. I'm not going to go back to the design. The zoom controls are in the way. And so that's wrong. So now what I can do is I can go and look at my code and find the part of the code that's actually introducing that. And yes, true, there is only edit in there. So I must have forgotten to put the recipe name in there. The good news is there's a very simple test change over here. I can add the recipe name back, and then, of course, it'll be fixed. But let's go look at how did that slip through my tests, because I wrote tests for this. So if I go into my test for this component, I'll see that it's testing the edit button. I see that it's grabbing the accessible name for that button, which is a library function that we've written on top of Axe Core. And my assertion is saying, does that have the text edit at the beginning? So I was trying to be smart here and say, okay, I'm going to create a regular expression to make sure edit is at the beginning of my text, but I forgot to test the rest of the text. So it's pretty much the problem here is the assertion is not good enough. So I'm going to save you all the typing. I'm just going to cut and paste the actual solution into here. By taking either out of the database or somewhere the text I'm expecting to appear on the different buttons, and by just iterating over all the buttons and testing them, I can add a regression test here that will break if the developer ever breaks the accessibility as intended by the designer for this particular button element. So I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to run Cypress interactively again so we can see that running in action. So here I go to start up Cypress. Now, of course, this all runs in Source Labs as well. It's the same set of tests we ran before with just a slightly different test for the keyboard. And you'll notice everything runs. And you'll see now there's a bunch more tests for the edit buttons where it's actually testing the text to make sure that the edit button text is appropriate. So what I've done there is I've taken my manual testing tool and I've used that manual testing tool to write an assertion that asserts something that's very important for accessibility in a way that I now never have to run that manual testing tool again during regression, because I've encoded that knowledge into my normal functional tests. And that's a technique that we recommend for taking the things that cannot be tested automatically, testing them using some tools that make it very effective and very fast to test for accessibility during your development, like the Axe DevTools tool, and then encoding that into assertions inside your functional tests so that you never have to test for that unless something changes. So for example, if your browser changed or your screen reader, a new version of the screen reader came out, something like that, you might have to test again, depending on the type of testing you're doing. In our case, we just run the Axe DevTools tools again to make sure that we're still accessible. But you never have to really run all your manual accessibility tests again. Okay, so if you do that, what benefit does that bring to your dev team? So we've looked at our data again for this, and we found that the impact of adding the Axe DevTools, what we call intelligent guided testing, on top of what you get from the Axe core fully automated testing, you get somewhere between 76 and 84% of your issues can be found using this sort of approach. And that also means that up to 84% of your accessibility can be tested automatically during your regression cycles. The good news about this is, if you noticed while I was running the tool, it didn't ask me any questions that a non-accessibility expert would be able to answer. It asked me questions that any developer or tester should be able to answer on their own. So even novices with no specialized accessibility training can find these issues using this tool. And that's really how we recommend you integrate accessibility testing into your overall development lifecycle. Start with the design. Make sure you communicate that design intent to your developers, your testers, and the rest of your team. Then they can use that in their development efforts to create their tests and test stuff while they're developing it. And people like the product owner, and even maybe got some manual auditors down the line, can then utilize that information themselves using the same tools to verify that the requirements are being met. And then the key takeaways, then if you do this, really you add another 30% of automation on top of what Axe Core can help you do. So the Axe Tools Intelligent Guided Testing helps you catch another 30%. So what are the other key takeaways? Use tools to improve your automated tests. Tools like Axe DevTools can really help you. If you do this, 100% of your accessibility regression can be automated. And remember that accessibility ideally begins with design and flows through all team members. What do we integrate with? Well, of course, we integrate with Source Labs. That's why we're here today. But we also integrate with all the different test frameworks that you might want to use together with Source. We integrate with Chime, Mocha, RSpec, Puppeteer, et cetera, et cetera. We also have, I'm not showing them to you today, but we also have equivalent functionality for native mobile, both iOS and Android. So if you want to look at that or try it out for yourself, contact us. If you want a trial of Axe DevTools, you can just go to axe.deque.com and sign up for a free 2-week trial. We are looking for lead customers. When I showed you the dashboard, Source Labs dashboard today, and talked about the fact that you can get information into that with accessibility, that's kind of using the default capability. We're working with Source Labs right now on a tighter integration between accessibility testing and the Source Labs dashboards. So if you're interested in that, please contact us at AXETEAM, that's AXETEAM @deque.com, and we'd like to work with you to arrive at the sort of solution that's going to satisfy the customers of Source Labs as well as our customers. Thank you very much for attending my presentation, and enjoy the rest of SauceCon.